Hello everyone, welcome back to Rare Japanese Sounds, and I'm pretty excited about today's topic because I'd like to take you all on a journey through the very famous Hiroshi Yoshimura's works, all the way from his earliest albums to all the way after his death. And I'd like to structure that video not really as a music critique, but more like a collector's guide. My goal for this video is going to take absolutely every single album that Mr. Yoshimura's ever been a part of, to look at it from a collector's perspective and to try and evaluate it on two different criteria. One will be the musical value of the album. Of course, this is going to be rather subjective, but I'm going to try and be as neutral as possible and try to evaluate the album on its significance among the works of Mr. Yoshimura. And on the other hand, I will be assigning a grade on collectibility, on how the album is collectible, how rare it is, how expensive it is, how awesome it sounds when you tell someone you have a copy of it. So those are going to be the two indicators we're going to use to describe each album, and for every of them I will try to look at the number of times this particular album, this particular release was sold on Yahoo auctions over the last 5 years, and also how much you can expect to spend to get a near-mint copy as of May 2020. So without further ado, let's get started. And while you might think we would start by covering 9 Postcards, which is generally considered to be the first ever album by Mr. Yoshimura, we're actually going to be first looking at something called Clouds for Alma. So Clouds for Alma is actually a music that was written by Hiroshi Yoshimura in '79, and that was written for koto. So what is exactly koto? It's sort of a Japanese traditional harp, and this music actually appeared in one random album of koto traditional music. Anyway, this is really a very niche album. It's not even Yoshimura who played the music himself, and I only find 3 ever sold on Yahoo auctions since 2015, and the price you could expect to get one would be something around 7,000 to 8,000 yen, which would be something like $70 to $80. So musical value of the album? I don't know, it really depends on whether or not you like traditional Japanese harp, but for me it would be something around the C because it's very poorly known, not generally regarded as a canon Yoshimura work, and only really for the die-hard fans. As for the collectible value, well, again, it depends on how much you're into collecting everything that Yoshimura has ever worked on, but personally I would also rate it a C because not many people are going to be interested in it, as it is really far away from what you usually expect from a Yoshimura album. So next up is the album that you all probably expected to go first, which is 9 Postcards, and is generally considered to be the first solo album by Hiroshi Yoshimura. In any case, I think the album sold quite well at the time, well, at least when you compare it to most of Yoshimura's other albums. And it was actually released in the Sound Process label in the Wave Notation series alongside the very famous Steelway album by the creator of the Wave Notation concept, Satoshi Ashikawa. Anyway, it's an extremely famous album and considered to be a monument of Japanese minimalistic ambient music. So for that reason, it's really something you can't miss out on if you start collecting Yoshimura's works. It's not as rare as you might think because I managed to find 25 sold on Yahoo auctions over the last 5 years. Of course, this remains extremely rare, but not as rare as some of the ones we will see following it. And the average price you could expect to get a clean copy would be somewhere around 25,000 yen or $250. Musical value, I'd go with an A because it's one of the cornerstones of Yoshimura's works. As for the collectible value, I will go with an A-, just because it lacks that extra rarity of other albums like Green or Wetland that really factor into the wow reaction that people will say when you actually have the album. Moving on to a release that most people might not know because 9 Postcards was actually also released on cassettes, even in 1982, and this release is, well, so rare that people just barely know about it, and there is nothing much else to say about it. It's just an extremely rare cassette release of the same album. I've only managed to find one of those sold on Yahoo Auctions since 2015, and it went for the equivalent of $19 or so. As for the musical value, well, not much. I would give it a D because simply it's a cassette tape and the sound quality on cassette tapes is just pretty bad. For collectible values, well, maybe a B because just how rare the cassette is, and it's an interesting piece of music history because it's the cassette release of an extremely influential album. Now, if you weren't very excited about the cassette release of 9 postcards, what about the promo cassette release of 9 postcards? I actually have no idea what this release is exactly about because I only have the Discogs listing for my information, but it seems like it was a self-distributed promo copy by Hiroshi Yoshimura made by himself or something. It looks like it was sold for a fair bit of money back in 2015 on Discogs, and justifiably so because I don't know how many of those copies exist, maybe a dozen or so. In any case, for its musical value, again, not much, unless the recording is actually different from the one on the LP, but there is no way to tell. As for collectible value, well, this one is more of a museum piece than anything else, and if you can get your hands on it, which, well, I would be jealous if you would, but if you manage to get your hands on it, then yes, by all means, this is a solid A, maybe A plus even, because there are no others like it. Now, moving on to the 9 postcards reissue, we have first the 1999 CD reissue on the Crescent label. And you should keep in mind the name Crescent as a label for reissues because it's actually a fairly well-known album that published CDs of ambient music like the self-titled Inoyama Land album, and also the Music for 4 Postcards album by Yoshimura, which we'll cover later in this video. In any case, the label is pretty well known for releasing very rare stuff and hard to find nowadays, so it's a pretty interesting release from that standpoint. I'm not sure exactly how many of those sold on Yahoo Auctions over the last 5 years, but probably not more than 8 or 9. In any case, the problem with all 9 postcard reissue in general is that apparently the master tapes for this album were lost somewhere, which means anytime you hear a reissue of 9 postcards, it's actually taken from a vinyl rip, and that includes this 1999 CD. As a result, the grade I will give for general musical value is D again, because you just get a poorer quality than you would with a perfectly clean LP. As for the collectible value, I would give it something like a B-, because on one hand, it's a pretty popular release, again, and by a popular label. On the other hand, it's not the original, and it doesn't make much sense because it's not taken from the original master tapes. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but if you're into rare Japanese ambient labels, why not? And now for another 9 postcard CD reissue, which was released in 2011 by the Nuvola label, which you might know for re-releasing the 4 postcards CD and the Softwave CD in 2005. In any case, they also re-released 9 postcards as a CD in 2011, but there is not much to say about it other than it's a reissue and it still has the same problem of not being taken from the master tape, so pretty poor sound quality. As a result, I would give it a D for the musical value and again a D for the collectible value because there is not much sense in buying this one. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the 2017 and 2020, I guess, reissue by Empire of Signs, and it's one of the first time one of Yoshimura's albums was ever released in the US, that's excluding the original release of Green, of course. But still a great achievement, and I'm really glad that people all over the world can access his albums much more easily than before. Of course, I'm aware that there have been some pressing quality issues, but since I don't have a copy, I can't really comment on that. But in any case, for the musical value, I would not go above a C because it's just a reissue of the original LP, and given the mixed feedback on sound quality, I wouldn't go out of my way to give it a higher grade than that. As for collectability, well, it's hard to tell, and it might be that in 20 years people will be obsessed with the idea of collecting Yoshimura's albums that were released outside Japan, but more realistically, it's probably something like a C- because people just want the originals and they are well, just more appealing than a release that came out 35 years later in the US. And by the way, you can note that I didn't make a distinction between, the clear wax repress and the standard black wax repress. It's because, in my opinion, it really doesn't matter. The color of the wax is just a marketing tool made to, well, make you spend more money on records. And on one hand, I don't think it's bad, especially when you give the exclusivity of the, let's say, the white color to only indie shops, because it makes, well, them more likely to get sales than just online retailers. But I personally don't really care, and as a pure collectible standpoint, I will just give them the same grade, especially because they're both reissues of the same album. So finally, we have another album, and this time it's Pier Loft from, I think, 1983. And its story is pretty interesting because apparently it was made for a fashion exhibition at the Seibu department store in Ikebukuro, Tokyo, which was also called Pier Loft. I'm not exactly sure about the details of the release, but I would guess that the cassette tape, because this album was only released on cassette tape originally, was exclusively sold inside the exhibition. There is no way to verify that, but given the very high rarity of the album, I would guess that that was the case. I only found one copy ever sold on Yahoo Auctions since 2015, and the price is something between $400 and $500. As far as the musical value is concerned, I would give it a B+, because it's a very unique album in terms of just composition and melody by Yoshimura, but without giving my personal opinion, I would just say, just because it's unique and it's generally well appreciated, I would give it a B+. As for the collectible value, I'm gonna go with an A-, because even though the album is quite popular and extremely rare, you have the issue of the cassette tape formats that degrades quite easily and is pretty fragile. So I would be pretty worried about it degrading over time if I bought one, so not exactly sure about that. Of course, Pier Loft was also reissued as an LP in 2017 in Japan only. And usually I'm not a big fan of reissues, as you could tell from my comments before, but this one is particular because it's the first LP release of an album that was previously unavailable on LP, which makes this particular release pretty, well, attractive to audiophiles and collectors alike, because it's the first time you can listen to the music with good quality and not having to worry about cassette tape formats. So yes, same grade for the musical value, and actually I'm going to give it a solid B for collectible value, just because it's an interesting release and it's possible that with enough time it's going to become quite valuable, because I don't think that many people have a copy of it. Okay, moving on, we have an album that is actually much more accessible than the others, and it's no other than A.I.R In Resort. For those of you who might wonder, well, why is it much more accessible than the others? It's because it was actually given out for free in Shiseido stores in 1984. Shiseido stores are a chain of cosmetic and that kind of items, and whenever during a special event called A.I.R In Resort, someone would buy a perfume of that event, that would be given the record for free with its plastic sleeve and all that in a green plastic bag. Well, that's pretty good, but that also means that a lot of people have it, and it's probably the album by Hiroshi Yoshimura that has the lowest value of them all, which isn't bad. It means that a lot more people can have it, and that's a good thing. It's a good introductory album for the rest of Yoshimura's works. So yeah, when you look at the number of albums sold in 5 years, you are not at something like 8 or 12, you're at more than 300. And the price for the album without the green plastic bag is something like 2,000 yen, so $20 or so. And with the plastic bag, it's closer to $50. So musical value, I don't know, it's a pretty good album. It's not generally considered as one of the top albums by Yoshimura, but still considered very good, so I would say B+. And for the collectible value, well, it's a bit more difficult because there are so many copies out there, it's just not as appealing as a collector as the other albums. I would just say buy a copy just to have it, to listen to it, enjoy it, but just as a pure collectible item, maybe something like a C-. Next up, you've been waiting for it, and it's Green. It's the most famous album by Hiroshi Yoshimura, probably. And here I'm referring more specifically to the Japanese LP release of it. So yeah, I don't know really what else to say about Green? It's just its most popular album. Everybody wants it, and that's why it's something priced around something like $800 to $1,000, depending on where you're looking at, and only about a dozen sold on Yahoo auctions over the last 5 years, which is not that bad, all things considered. Well, for the musical value, if I have to give an A+ to something, disregarding my personal opinion of it, it would be this album, because just of how emblematic and popular this is, I have to give it an A+. For collectible value, well, again, if I have to give an A+ to something, it would be this one, just because everybody wants it. And that's despite the upcoming, because as of May 2020, it has not been released yet, the upcoming reissue by Light in the Attic. Just taking a few seconds to mention the promo cassette that was also released in Japan at the same time, but I don't have any more information on it than what's on the Discogs page, so just going to say that it exists, and my comments are pretty much the same as for the promotional cassette for 9 Postcards too. Honestly, I've always wondered why Green was the most popular album by Yoshimura out there, and why not any of his other albums. And honestly, I think it's mostly because it's his only album that was released in the US at the same time as it was released in Japan, which is, well, not the case for any of his other albums. And you have on one hand the CD release, and on the other hand the cassette release. So starting with the CD, well, it's a pretty good way to get the original CD of the album, especially if you like the added sound effects that were on the American release and that weren't on the Japanese one. And also the Japanese release simply didn't have a CD, so that's pretty unique. And for that, I will give it let's say A or A- for the musical value, depending on whether you prefer with the sound effects or without the sound effects. And as for collectible value, probably a B+, because it's not an LP, so you don't get the same prestige as you would with an LP. But still, it's a unique release. It was released in the US, which is a rarity for any Yoshimura album, and yeah, solid B+. As for the US cassette release, well, I have the same opinion as I had with the 9 Postcards cassette release, which is that it's not great as something to listen to, but it's a pretty good item to have as a collectible. But that's all I can say about it. And finally, I need to give a few words about the upcoming Light in the Attic reissue of Green, just because of how popular the album is and how great it is that it's getting a reissue in the US directly. On the other hand, well, you have to look at how many of those Light in the Attic is reissuing, and by that I'm meaning how many versions of it is reissuing. I think they have 3 different types of wax for the LP, plus a CD, plus the cassette. And in addition to that, they're probably also going to do the same thing for the American version with the added sound effects. So you're going to be flooded with different versions, and that's what they want. They want you to have a lot of choice and to buy whatever you feel most comfortable with. But even though it's great for the, just being able to listen to the album without having to spend $1,000 for the original Japanese issue, well, as a collectible, it's probably not going to be great, and I have to give it something like a C or C-, unless the print runs are extremely limited and it becomes an extremely sought-after item. But without knowing anything in advance, I would probably not be very optimistic about its value in the future, at least not within 20 years or so. So next up we have Surround, that was actually released in the same year as Green, but this one was made particularly for a corporation called Misawa Home. And what Misawa Home was doing was, well, building and selling pre-made houses. And my understanding of this album is that it was probably played in demonstration houses, model houses, and might have been given or sold to customers after they bought one of those pre-made houses. I'm not exactly sure, but what I know is that they made a whole series of albums like that made for interior music. And the general label, Misawa Home, is considered as being pretty collectible, and especially the first 3 albums. Actually, we're going to cover another of the Misawa albums in this video later. In any case, Surround has the interesting fact of having been released at the same time on LP, CD, and cassette, because we're in 1986 and all those three formats coexisted at the same time. But of those three, well, LP is not the most common and it's actually pretty hard to find. It's actually about as rare as green, I would say, with about a dozen sold on Yahoo Auctions since 2015, and the general sold price being something around $400 to $500, maybe more. It's difficult to tell for sure. Now, when it comes to musical value, it depends on whether you like the more passive ambient music by Yoshimura or the more active melodic music. In this case, we're really on the ambient side, and something that I really could imagine being played at a model house. And for that, I'm going to give it a B, but it really depends on your taste. As for collectible value, it's again probably something like an A or A minus, just because it's extremely rare and very collectible because of its unique story and nice aesthetic. Now, that was for the LP. Now, the CD is much more common and easy to find than the LP for some reason. Maybe it's because by 1986, CD sales were slowly starting to outpace LP sales, and for that reason, it's easier to find the CD release of Surround. When it comes to musical value, then I would give it a pretty good grade. It's the same album, but you get a better sound quality in general because you don't have to worry about the imperfections of vinyl record. But as for collectible value, well, it's just not as big. You don't have the huge paper sleeve. You don't have the nice insert about sound design aesthetic. It's just not as good. So I'm going to have to go with something like B minus or C plus. And finally, Surround on cassette tape. Well, we know that it exists because it's mentioned on the obi of the LP of the same release, and also because in one book by Yoshimura, we can see a picture of the cassette for Surround. But apart from that, we just know that it exists, and I've never seen it for sale or anything else, never seen it in person, so there is not much I could tell, except that it probably has a pretty good collectible value if you ever can get your hands on one. Another interesting fact about Surround is that it was the last album by Yoshimura to have been released on LP at the time of release. And moving on to the following album, which was also on the Misawa label, and which is called Static. This one was published in 1988 as part of the same series as Surround, but this time only on CD. So the album itself is not very well known, and that's mostly due to the fact that it's a piano solo album, and Mr. Yoshimura is not very well known for that. But it remains a pretty good album musically, and also a very accessible album for those of you who have tight budgets. I think I found around 15 or 16 of those sold in Yahoo Auctions, and the price is something around the ballpark of $40 or so. As for musical value, well, if you like piano solo and the general aesthetic of that, it would be a good grade, but in most cases it would probably be a C because that's not what people expect from a Yoshimura album. As for collectible value, well, probably again a C because it's not that rare, but it's part of a very collectible label, and I think that makes it more interesting than if it was a standalone release. And again, it's pretty accessible, and it's a good album to collect if you like to just collect all releases by Hiroshi Yoshimura. Interestingly enough, Static got re-released in 2003, not as a record, not as a CD, but as a CD book, and was accompanied by a small essay that was written by Yoshimura himself. And although I've not had the pleasure to read the book, I heard it's considered to be quite good, but that's all I can tell you. For its musical value, well, same as before, not much has changed from the original CD, but for the collectible value, I would give it a higher grade because even though it's not the original, it is a pretty unique release and comes with something that was written by Yoshimura himself and comes in a pretty cool packaging, in my opinion. Now, the next album we're going to cover is called Pier Loft Remix 89. And the thing is, I'm not completely sure it actually exists because the only proofs I have of it existing are the Wikipedia page of Hiroshi Yoshimura. And, well, it's a small picture of it from the same book in which we saw the cassette tape for Surround. So there is not much credit to being sure that it exists. I have found absolutely nothing on it. and you just have to take my word and the Wikipedia page and the book for it. But since there is a picture, I guess we can assume that it does exist, although it's hard to tell what exactly is in the album, except maybe a Pier Loft remix. So musical value, no idea, but collectible value, definitely A+ if you can even find it. Next up is another very obscure album, which is called Otonoshima, or Sound Island. And what we know about it is that it's a series of recordings made by Yoshimura in various places outside his house. Well, that is for the first half of the album, and the second half actually also has a few synth music. That is for the first half, and the second half actually has a little synth music going along with it. It's pretty hard to tell because the full album isn't available on YouTube, but that we can infer from the few things that are available to us. Only 1 or 2 were sold in Yahoo auctions since 2015, I think, and the price is around $300 or so. As for the musical value, well, it's not great because half of the album is only sound recordings, and unless you're into that particular quote-unquote sound photography, as Yoshimura said, it's pretty hard to give it a lot of value in terms of music, but to each their own. As for its collectible value, maybe something like a B, because although it's crazy rare again, it's not as recognizable as Pier Loft, and it doesn't have the same appeal because half of the album doesn't have music on it. Still a very unique release though. Okay, next up, a pretty popular one for a change is going to be Wetland. And Wetland, I think, wasn't very popular until very recently when the YouTube algorithm started to really pick up on it. And before that it was practically forgotten, but now it's probably easily in the top 5 and maybe in the top 3 of Yoshimura's albums, depending on who you ask. This album was only released on CD, and it was part of a series called Music for Your Mind, published by the label Eastworld, and that was composed of 5 CDs in total. And to be honest, that whole series of 5 albums is pretty collectible, and of course Wetland remains the most famous of the 5 and the most desired. Unsurprisingly, it's extremely hard to find, and only a dozen have been sold on Yahoo auctions, and the recent near-mint price for it would be something between $250 and $300. As for the musical value, I have to give it an A because just of how popular it is. Collectible value, again, an A because it's rare, it's a unique release, not released in different formats, different countries, you don't have to worry about that. Extremely popular, extremely hard to find, you have all the ingredients for a great release in terms of collectability. Oh, and I just wanted to note that it's very likely that Wetland will be getting a reissue at some point, especially knowing that Light in the Attic, when announcing the green reissue, said that they were going to reissue more works by Yoshimura under the title of Water Copy. And they said there were going to be 4 albums total, and I would be very surprised if Wetland wasn't going to be part of something called Water Copy, but that's just my 2 cents. Next up is a weird one, and I'm saying that because it's Face Music, published in 1994, and is what I assume to be a collaboration between Yoshimura and a makeup school, and the music is something between electronic music and opera. It's really, really strange, and it's completely unexpected of something by Yoshimura, but it's still a pretty unique album, and I kind of like it, to be honest. In any case, definitely among his weirdest release, and I've seen a lot of copies of it popping up on Yahoo auctions during the last month, something like a dozen in only 30 days, which is extremely uncommon, and I'm wondering what's up with that. The good news is that you can get it for $50 even in really good condition, and it's even possible to find sealed copies sometimes, as is mine, for example. But honestly, for the musical value, I would not go above a C+, just because of how weird the release is and because it's not what people expect from a Yoshimura release. Same for collectible value, well, I thought it was rarer than it actually is because given all the copies popping up on Yahoo auctions recently, I don't really know what to think. And I'm probably going to go with, again, C or C+. It's not something that people will go after extremely actively in any case. Next up is a much more normal album because it's Quiet Forests, released in 1996 by the Prem Promotion label, I think. And this one is, yes, much more of a standard album, if you can call any of Yoshimura's albums standard. What's for sure is that it solidifies the trend of Yoshimura going away from ambient music and more towards a mix of electronic and new age music, but I actually like the album. It's a pretty good listen, especially when looking for something more active than most of his other albums. I found it sold 16 times or so on Yahoo Auctions over the last 5 years, and you can get it for something around $50, which is a pretty good price comparing to most of the other albums. Strangely enough, not many people know of the album, or not many people enjoy it a lot, so I'm going to have to give only a B- for its musical grade, but for its collectible value, I would also give it a B-. It's still pretty good, but it's not that rare and it's not that desired, but maybe if people's tastes change with time, it might become a more desired album and ramp up in price. Next up, we have a compilation actually, which is called Ku tsu ro gi no ongaku, or Relaxing Music. I'm only mentioning it really because one of Yoshimura's tracks from Green appears on the compilation, but that's really all there is to say. It's not particularly interesting or notable. It's just the only compilation in which Yoshimura appears at all, and I think that's a pretty interesting fact in and of itself. I don't think the album is particularly rare or expensive, but it's an interesting fact and you should keep it in mind. As you may or may not know, Quiet Forest was actually the last album to have been released prior to Yoshimura's death. And the following one, Music for 4 Postcards, not 9 postcards, was released right after his death as part of a retrospective that was held in his honor at the Kanagawa Prefectural Museum of Modern Art. What's interesting to note is that the label releasing it was not the Prime Promotion label, which was the one that released Quiet Forest, but actually the Crescent label that released the reissue of 9 postcards back in 1999, which makes the album particularly rare because of, again, the Crescent label being generally considered as rare. But because of the abundance of reissues, it's not very difficult to find one in one of the later reissues, as we'll see just now. But for this particular original release, I would give it a musical value of maybe A- or B+, because it remains one of the cornerstones of Yoshimura's work, right up there with 9 postcards as his first album and this one as quote-unquote his last. Now for the collectible value, I'm also going to go with a B+, because it's a pretty rare original album to find, and despite the fact that it was reissued by another label later on, I think it's still an interesting album to have an original copy of, especially if you can find one. As for the collectible value, I'm gonna go with a B+ again, because it's part of the Crescent label, which is regarded as very collectible. But I'm not gonna go too high because it's still a recent release and it doesn't have the same cachet as one of the originals from the 80s. And also because you can find some of the reissues which we are going to cover just now. So yes, 4 Postcards was also reissued in 2011, but also in 2013, 2016, and 2019 by the label Nuvola, which we talked about when we mentioned the 9 Postcards reissue from 2011. Not much to say about that one really, it's just a reissue of the original, and actually extremely similar. It's very hard to differentiate between the two if you don't have the obi with you, because on the original it says the last work of Hiroshi Yoshimura, whereas on all of the Nuvola releases it says Hiroshi Yoshimura's last album instead. So yeah, I'm not really going to give a grade for musical or collectible value because it's actually a new album. You can buy it on the Nuvola website, and that way you can support the music industry and the Yoshimura estate if you'd like to. So 4 Postcards was released in 2004, and in 2005 Nuvola actually released an original for another album, which is called Softwave. Now, Softwave is quite interesting because it compiles works from very early on in the history of Yoshimura. I think it was between 73 and 76, so it predates even the earliest previous works from Clouds for Alma and so on. It's actually very interesting to hear what Yoshimura was composing this early on in his history as a music composer, not using any synths at all, but only analog sounds from music boxes, a violoncello and a saxophone, I think. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting listen. And again, I'm not going to give any grades on collectability or musical value because it's a new album. You can buy it from the Nouveau website right now if you'd like to. And hooray, finally we arrived to the last album that I know of by Hiroshi Yoshimura, as my voice is breaking, but of course it's a fan favorite. It's Flora, at least Flora 1987, because this album is actually a compilation of works that Yoshimura did in 1987 from an unreleased album, and they took the opportunity to release it after his death. But I don't think many people actually knew of this album when it released in 2006 by, again, Prem Promotion, the same ones that released Quiet Forest back in 1996. So in any case, it's quite a bit rarer than 4 Postcards or Softwave. And it might be one of the reasons why the album has become so popular recently. But honestly, I think there is a certain charm to the album because it's quite different from Surround or Green that were released around the same time in 1996. And if Yoshimura did compose this album in 1987, then you have some really interesting pieces of music. The crazy part about this is that I only found 9 copies sold on Yahoo Auction since 2015, which is crazy low for a 2006 album that fetches between $150 and $200. Actually, on Discogs, one of them actually sold for more than $400, I think. It's crazy. So musical value, again, I have to give it a solid A because it's always in the top 5 of most people's rankings of Yoshimura albums. Collectible value, this one I'm not exactly sure because it's so recent that it's dangerous for me to give an A to something that might be re-released at the CD with almost the exact same appearance. So I'm still going to give it a B+ because it's very famous and someone actually paid $400 for it. So I can't not give it a high grade, but I would recommend to exercise caution when considering to buy the album, unless you find it for a good price, in which case, go ahead. So I said Flora was the last album, but there is a very last one that I only know of from a single YouTube video on which we can see the front of a CD that definitely seems to be something done by Yoshimura, but all I can tell is that it seems to have been done somewhere in the 90s, maybe very early 2000, because it was linked to the Sound Process Design Company, I think it's called, which was responsible for the Crescent label, remember? So it can't be too old. And at the same time, it seems to have been ordered by the Cebu department store, remember? The same one from the Pier Loft exhibition, from which the Pier Loft album came out in 1983. So it's pretty interesting, but I have absolutely no details on it and have never seen it for sale anywhere. It's not even on Discogs. So yeah, we did it. We finally managed to cover every single Yoshimura album from all the way from 1979 to today. And of course, it's still possible that we miss something along the way, but that's all the pleasure of collecting rare Japanese music. It's always possible that you miss something more obscure than what you thought was already the most obscure album out there. What's crazy is that we've not even discussed all the other aspects of Yoshimura's career, from his several books to his very characteristic drawings of scores falling apart, to his various participations to art festivals or sound design installations. By the way, for those of you who have actually watched the video until the very end, I have a pretty good, what you could say, a surprise for you. It's actually something that you hear if you take the metro in Tokyo on the Mito line, and when a train is about to start, you hear this melody that I linked in a video in the description below. It's actually a melody that was composed by Hiroshi Yoshimura, and after riding the subway all these times, I never thought it was him until I learned that very recently, so I thought you might enjoy it too. Anyway, let me know if you'd like me to cover all those other aspects of Yoshimura's career, or if you'd like me to take another collector's perspective on another artist. In any case, never hesitate to let me know your suggestion. This was Rare Japanese Sounds, and until next time, stay tuned.